Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Naledi Pandor. Thank you very much for joining us this Sunday evening. Now, the academic year has barely gotten off the ground, yet already several universities are or have been in a shutdown. The students are protesting, demanding better access and accommodation for poor students, and most importantly, the free education that they were promised by the government. You'll remember that historic announcement made by former president on the eve of Nasrec in 2017. Now, the students also want historic debt to be scrapped. We know that the challenges facing South African higher education are linked to the wider challenges facing South Africa: poor economic growth, high youth unemployment, and dare I say, politics. The students have taken their fight right to the seat of government. You'll remember the march to the union buildings a couple of years ago. But it seems that the universities have borne the brunt of the displeasure and anger. So, can universities solve these structural problems? And has the government done its part in supporting students who cannot afford education, as well as the institutions tasked with educating these students? Tonight on Unfiltered, we ask, can South Africa achieve free, inclusive higher education? Can South Africa achieve free, inclusive higher education? Make your thoughts known to us on our various platforms, including social media. Joining me now, we are honored and Unfiltered to have the Minister of Higher Education and Training, Naledi Pandor. Minister, welcome to the program. I know that you had an 8-hour meeting with students yesterday, and yet in his State of the Nation address, the President appealed to university management and student representatives to find each other, to find the solutions to the problems in higher education. It sounds as if the burden is on the students and the institutions to find each other and deal with these complex problems. Where does the government stand?
Good evening, Reddy, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Good evening to the viewers as well. The government stands squarely with all the stakeholders in the higher education sector, because that's our responsibility. That's why we held the meeting, and the meeting is not the first contact. We have been in process with all the sector from the beginning of the year, have been having meetings. In fact, as higher education, we spent much of December preparing for 2019, particularly ensuring that the National Student Financial Aid Scheme would, for the first time by January, begin informing institutions who will be a beneficiary of the scheme. And we achieved that for the first time in many years in January this year. So we really are trying to ensure that as a department, a ministry, and our entities, we are responsive to the challenges.
All right, we'll just break them down bite sizes. Let's start with historic debt, which in some universities, UKZN, 800 million rand, Wits University, 100, Durban University of Technology, where the student unfortunately was killed in that tragic incident. We'll talk about it. Mr. Madonsela lost his life there, about 300 million rand. It seems as if the burden of historic debt is so overwhelming that there's no university that can make further concessions without losing its sustainability. Universities, we know, must fulfill their fiduciary duties. How are we going to work our way around this problem? What does the government put on the table with historic debt?
Well, there's been a major problem in the funding of higher education in South Africa, in that, as you would be aware, for several years, the funding had not kept up with the costs of higher education, and we'd never reached that target of 1% of GDP that had been on the table for several years. This is similar with what we had in science and technology in my previous portfolio. We, however, had government from 2018 substantially increasing the subsidy provided to higher education institutions for the first time in many, many years. And that support then begins to be a relief to institutions insofar as the high cost of higher education is concerned. And the fact of fully funded students again reduces this difficulty of financial management that many universities and colleges had complained about.
But they're saying, and you have mentioned it, that the support is not commensurate with the burden of debt, and it would be totally irresponsible
we said that the
for
debt
them.
would be treated in a different process.
Do the students know that?
Yes,
because
very,
they're calling
very
on
much. They do
universities
know
to scrap the debt.
If you look at all the statements I have made since February last year, look at what has been said before that.
That's what
we have said to them that what will be done is there's a 3-department team working on this matter. It's not something you unravel overnight, because in quantum, you're talking of over 9 billion rand. But you're putting into the system for support to students 30.8 billion this year. So I think appreciate what the public purse is trying to do.
But the students don't accept it. That's the point I'm making, that the students don't seem to believe you or to trust that this will happen, because they're still chanting and calling for historic debt to be scrapped. And any vice-chancellor can make a populist decision and say, I'm cancelling this, but the university will collapse.
They can't do that, I mean, obviously, and this is why we've said we have a process where we're looking at what measures can be taken, what model we might develop in order to assist institutions. And we've said for those students who are NSFAS-funded students who might have a historic debt, they should be allowed to register by signing an acknowledgement of debt form so that we collect the data properly. And when we come to a point where we have said we have resources, we've worked out what the exact obligations are, and we are now able to provide resources, government will then do so. But now we've said for those who are the poorest, and that is what the announcement of free higher education gave attention to. It didn't say for all students.
But Minister, that's so important, because I don't think that South Africans in general paid attention to the granular details. Former President Jacob Zuma said 350,000 households.
You as a professional have to ask yourself, as I
did. But the point is,
why are we not communicating this?
But that's the point I'm saying, that what comes out of the mouths of some prominent student leaders and politicians, it's the election year, so people can distort information.
Certainly not from the
they're saying free education.
No,
but there's a caveat.
And
it's first year, isn't it? Phased over 5 years. So what happens in second year and third year?
This year it's first and second.
What happens in third and fourth year?
So third years next year, who would have begun 2018 with that support, they will be in their final year with that support.
The World Bank says this model is not sustainable, that they would have wanted an income contingent
loan. Well, we've told them
what are you saying to that?
The model we've put in place, we believe that it is sustainable.
They say it will add 1% cost to GDP over 5 years, and our economy is not growing.
I think they've over-counted in terms of who the beneficiaries are. I explained to them in a panel that we're talking... No, it's not first years. It was first year in 2018. 2019, it's first years and second years. But it's children who come from a family that has a threshold of 350,000 joint family income annually.
Do you think, Minister, that sufficiently addresses the missing middle?
It doesn't.
You've got, so what do we do with them? Because they're the ones
we've got to find a solution to that as well.
When?
But remember,
when universities are burning.
As I've pointed out, South Africa doesn't have limitless funds in the public purse. I think great efforts have been made. If a country is devoting 30 billion of public revenue to supporting young people, this, I think, is a major advance for a country. Absolutely, the issue of those who may be earning more but can't quite afford higher education, we must find a way of assisting. And we have done so in the past 3 years.
So that's very important what the Minister said, that poor students have been accommodated first and second year, phasing in over 5 years. It's important that you know it's when the household income is 350,000 per annum. This is important because what has been going on in South Africa, the discourse has certainly been free education for all, which in a country such as ours, with this depth of inequality, it would create other forms of inequality, and it would be unfair for those who can afford to be getting free education. What's also very, very important is that the Minister has been emphatic and said that universities cannot make concessions. They can't write off the historic debt because they will collapse. They've got to be other models that we pursue. And the missing middle, we'll still talk about that and find out what provisions are being made for the missing middle, which was very high on the agenda of fees must fall and protesting students. Stay with Unfiltered for more.
In a UN report, scientists say climate change is getting worse.
1/3 of our food sources for the population come out of the ocean.
We spoke to people who have been directly affected.
We have lost a lot of cattle. Gemsbokvlakte, Tosca gebied and Jakkalskop. Everywhere you will see there's animals dying.
I've lost 2 of my cattle this January.
Africa's demand for clean drinking water is rising.
Drinking water is a top priority.
The next day when the water comes back, it's dirty.
I have implemented a level 5 water restriction, effective immediately.
Environmentalists seek solution to preserve the planet.
This is a Cape Kirpa, which is also one of the endemic species that is only found within the Western Cape, so it occurs nowhere else in the world except in our water systems.
And thanks so much for staying with Morning Live. He described as unlawful the publishing of witness testimonies prior to being heard before the Commission.
It's almost like asking a parent who's your favorite child. But is there a moment that stands out for you?
We sat and we thought, how can we make blind people enjoy Unfiltered as well? Because it's television.
Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, and out of 180 countries, South Africa coming in at 73.
I really hope that, this year is going to be the year of fighting corruption.
Our shocking church abuses in the name of religion keep surfacing.
It's breaking the law. There's no church that should be allowed to do such things.
Yet 20,000 rand discount, bachelor's to master's degrees in Sandton.
It's widespread and it's a very lucrative market.
The question that we ask, for instance, political parties is, where do you get the information? Where do you get the cell phone numbers of voters?
Thank you so much for choosing us.
Welcome back. You are watching Unfiltered on SABC3. Tonight on the program, we speak to Higher Education Minister, well, it's Higher Education and Training, Minister Naledi Pandor, about some of the challenges plaguing our higher institutions of higher learning, particularly funding. What do we do with the missing middle, student accommodation? Minister, we're going to go back to the funding model in just a moment, but I do want to talk about student accommodation, and I use WITS as an example. So it had 6,200 beds available, but the demand was 14,000 beds. When the students protest and say the university must provide accommodation, how is a university supposed to do that when the maths doesn't add up?
Well, I think one of the things we've been trying to communicate to everybody is that we're not going to achieve all that we need in 1 year or 1 month or 1 week. There are significant needs out there. The system has grown tremendously, which is good for South Africa. And I've indicated that in the next 10 years, we have an infrastructure initiative to build 300,000 more places for accommodation in higher education institutions. I've said to students, you are members of the SRC, to the student leaders. Ask the university management to give you details as to the infrastructure grant I provided in the budget of this financial year. And let them give you the detail of the number of residence places that are going to be built through the fund released, because we're making allocations to institutions. Some are building 600, others 8, others 1,300. So there's a whole program of infrastructure provision.
So that's future benefits. You are now unequivocally saying for now the problem remains.
They've started building. Some will come into stream in 2020. Others already came into stream this year. So it's a program that's ongoing, but it's not yet the 10,000. And that's why in 2018 we said to reach what we think is the number that we need in the system is going to take us around 10 years. And remember, that higher education and training, much as I love it, is not the only priority of South Africa.
Just speaking of that, I mean, when the former President Jacob Zuma made the announcement of free education for that category, because that's important, and of course the President reiterated that message in his State of the Nation address, the midterm budget had to adjust, Treasury had to adjust and find some budget 57 billion rand, which means that you remove funding from other services and needs. Was government taken aback? I mean, have you caught your breath? Have you recovered from that surprise?
Well, we need the economy to grow in order to do more things. So we had agreed that this is a step that we would take as the government of South Africa, and we have made resources available.
Was it just politicking? You were not ready?
No, it wasn't politicking. We had to respond. And remember that everybody, all South Africans, including yourselves in the media, were fully supportive of this. None of you said, what a bad idea. Don't fund the students.
But it had to be implementable.
Don't begin.
Because
yes, no, it's implementable.
That can't be fulfilled.
This is why we put resources aside, took resources certainly from other departments, but we said this is a priority. It's being asked for by the public, the students. The universities are underfunded, as I have confirmed earlier. And this is a step toward improving in that regard. Now, if we improve the skills we produce in the country, then we begin to have persons who will respond to the needs of the economy, take up opportunities, hopefully become entrepreneurs, given the high-level skills they've acquired, create more jobs, and this filters in then into increased growth, which is an admission the World Bank report makes alongside its concerns about the sustainability of our funding model.
I mean, you raised something else that I was going to go to later about raising graduates that can respond to the demands of our economy. Part of the debate, or a theme of this debate, has been when you have instability at universities, or universities collapse because historical debt is too much, or the changes that you are implementing are not bearing fruit now. All that you will see is that your middle and higher income earners or students from those homes are going to go overseas because they've got options. You're going to see more private universities. And like with healthcare, it is the poor that are going to be left in that system that can't accommodate them. Is that a worry for you?
In higher education in South Africa, the public sector is the biggest component. The private is very, very small. I think even in the future, because it's very difficult to develop research-intensive universities in a private domain. So we have a very good public sector.
You don't envisage a situation where the private sector, like with medical aids, is populated by a small margin that has the income and the money?
It hasn't happened in other systems. I've studied systems worldwide, and what you find is that the private institutions go more toward the public relations, marketing, management, courses which are not entirely responsive to what the economy requires. You'll find it very difficult to find a private institution that's offering engineering or medicine or the sciences that you need as a country that is an emerging economy. So it is the public sector that is the one that provides those critical disciplines.
I want to go back to what the Hear Commission had recommended, an income contingent loan type of system. And we are getting tweets, I understand, from my producers, from people saying, but what do we do with the missing middle? Because that is the ticking time bomb. What do we do with them? And of course, the income contingent loan system, I think I need to explain to our viewers, it simply means that you start paying back when you reach a particular income threshold. Is that not so? Our viewers are demanding an answer for the missing middle.
Well, as I said to young people yesterday, to the leaders of student organizations, what we are looking at is a model that would be derived from some of the recommendations of the Hear Commission, because I don't think all categories of income will be addressed by that kind of loan system that has been recommended. And we cannot just launch into saying we're able to manage a loan system. What I think we should do as South Africa is have a multiplicity of models and institutions that are responsive to different needs of students in higher education.
Stay with us. We are going to talk about the often violent protests at universities and just ask the question, what happens tomorrow? Do stay with us.
On Network, we have gadgets, robots, and more.
A phone is no longer just an indulgent device or a functional device. It's a part of us.
What if 20 years from now, robots walk the streets alongside humans, doing many of the same jobs that you and I do today?
We find out what you mostly use your laptops for. Is it gaming or good old writing?
Education in the end must prepare young people for the workplace that is being rapidly transformed by technological change.
A new security system, Memeza, is adding a new dimension of safety, with some elderly people saying they feel much safer.
I think a big thing for people is they're just not aware of electric vehicles. They might not realize they're probably a lot easier to incorporate into their driving needs.
There's technology and social media news on Network every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and every Sunday at 5:30 p.m.
Welcome back. You are watching Unfiltered. Thank you so very much for staying with us. We're talking about education. I don't think that there's anybody in South Africa who doesn't care about education, from early childhood development to higher education. We want future generations to be able to be active participants in our economy, to be globally competitive and put South Africa on the global stage. Many have done so, but in a country such as ours, with high poverty levels and inequality, what do we do to make sure that education is accessible and that it is inclusive? The Minister of Higher Education and Training has been with us answering some of these questions. Minister, I do want to talk to you about the protests. Mr. Madonsela passed away. Lungisi Madonsela passed away. There's been a protest about the securitization of campus. UJ had a protest, Vets had a protest. It's a jarring image, isn't it, to see armed security on campus, to see the police. But universities are saying, when we call the police, they arrive 4 hours later. What do we do? But if you speak to the students, they say, we are unarmed and the vice-chancellors are calling security on us. How do you understand the problem and how do we solve it?
Well, I think what we've got to do is have security properly trained. I've said we're going to talk to the Association of Security Organizations to assist with training, but I think that there shouldn't be live ammunition on campuses.
No matter the circumstances.
Let me express my sincerest condolences to the Madonsela family on what I think is one of the most painful experiences a parent can go through, which is a loss of a child. I lost a child, and there's nothing more terrible than that. So I really wish to express my condolences to them. But let me say, I have said to students that protest is absolutely legitimate, but violent protest cannot be condoned, nor can destruction of property, nor can the intention to burn down anybody's property, staff members' cars, which has happened, burning of buildings previously, which has happened. So none of that should be tolerated. And we also need training on how we conduct a protest effectively without having to resort to violence. But I think on the security services, really I do agree that there's been an over-securitization, and it's a matter that needs to be looked at far more carefully.
Would you want to see the SAPS play a bigger role rather than private security, the state being present?
Where they've been called upon, they do respond. For example, I know that with Wits University last week, the SAPS responded. Sometimes I'm told they take long. I have had occasion to speak to Minister Cele, and he's been of assistance, even to the degree of coming onto some campuses to meet with students. But really, there's a practice and culture we all need to inculcate, and it's on all sides.
Okay. So how much of what's happening on our campuses has to do with politics generally in South Africa, contestation between certain political parties? Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that students must vacate the political space. We know that students, whether it's the Arab Spring, the civil rights movement, protest against the Vietnam War, our fight against apartheid here, students are part of our society. But are you comfortable with the proximity of political leadership to student politics? It seems that there's something far more at stake, particularly between the ANC and EFF students.
Well, I'm not able to comment on that because I'm not fully into students and their politics and how they engage with each other. I met with SRC presidents. I didn't ask them which formation they come from. I also met with the executive of the South African Union of Students. These are bodies that are legitimate representatives of the students. As to their political formation, that was a matter.
We've seen politicians on campus, but I suppose
I've not gone into. Well, I have been on a campus many times, and during election campaigns or registration, I have gone onto campuses and encouraged students to register to vote. I don't think that that's wrong. I think it's something we all must do. As to compelling students to be part of a particular formation,
no, obviously not.
I think that would be absolutely wrong.
And just on SASCO, I mean, the biggest student movement, I mean, those are the children of the ANC, and they are protesting on campus. What do you say to students? What do you say to them? You met with them yesterday. Some have said the shutdown continues. What is your message today on the eve of the new week, as it were?
Well, I've said to the students that there are issues that I believe need immediate attention. And I will be approaching institutional heads in order to discuss some of those matters. There are other matters they've raised which lie within my domain, and I've said to them where there are financial implications, one can't immediately address those matters. But where we are able to indicate action or movement on a matter, I will be making a statement this coming Friday on some of those matters.
Do you expect them to be in class tomorrow? Because we've heard that there'll be 100 students putting the whole campus on shutdown, 32,000 students affected by 100. Do you expect them to be in class tomorrow?
I hope that they will be in class. I think, I've said issues are legitimate. Students were unhappy with the statement I released last week. I said I think they've misconstrued my statement. There was no intention to suggest that the issues they raise are not legitimate. Okay. They are, but we are there in order to achieve a particular objective.
There's one issue that I have to ask quickly. At Wits, for example, they had a hardship fund, which meant that a student who had historical debt but passes can apply to return. But the students were demanding that even those who haven't passed must qualify. What do you say to students about their performance?
With the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, we have academic requirements for you to continue to be a beneficiary
your
of the
place
scheme.
at the university means someone else is out.
It's absolutely vital, and I have raised with students my concern about those who are in institutions for many, many years without a single credit.
We call them ancestors in my time.
And I think that's something we need to address.
Minister Naledi Pandor, much obliged. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, South Africa. We embrace this problem because it is our problem. We want young people to have a future in South Africa, to support them in a non-violent way, but in a way that is progressive and inclusive. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.